Thank you, Joy, and thank you, JNUTA, for giving me this opportunity to reconnect myself with जुड़ते जुड़ते. मैं तो ये सोच रहा था कि मैं टूटता बन टूटते हुए कहीं पे कर रहा हूँ जब से जेएनयू छोड़ा है, लेकिन फिर से जुड़ना बहुत अच्छा लग रहा. The topic that has been assigned to me is to talk about the deprivation points and the question of access to higher education. But we got to really understand that in spite of the very elaborate discussion in the parliament and the way this university was set up in '69, some of the objectives or the principles, founding principles, were not very easy to be implemented. But at the same time, we got to also look at the scenario which was obtaining in the country at that particular point of time, particularly in the North India. Some of the leading universities, BHU, some universities in Patna, in Bihar, in Bengal, also AMU. They were all on a very rapid decline, which has been discussed elsewhere in several books. And that is the context in which, we really saw JNU emerging or JNU being established. The higher education scenario at that particular point of time, if one were to perhaps look at the statistics, were predominantly in creating more spaces and opportunities for the property classes, the prevailing property classes, and the elite, and so on and so forth, in spite of the expansion which had taken place in various areas of higher education. The reach of the deprived sections, marginalized communities, was very, very limited. If one were to perhaps go by the statistics, the higher education enrollment was 1.5. The GER was 1.5 for the lowest community, that is the community which in fact, and that pertained even in about 70s and 80s, until such a time that, there were struggles on a continuous basis to in fact bring about some kind of an element of social justice and inclusivity. When JNU was established and the first batch was taken in 1971 with the MPhil PhD program, the MA program came later. We really didn't have a very elaborate kind of a laid out admission policy. It was like anywhere else, where one would perhaps recruit students on the basis of marks or on the basis of other criteria. We didn't have a very formidable kind of principle on which one could perhaps recruit the students. It took nearly 3 to 4 years until about '74, and that really didn't happen because the administration or the teachers had a very some kind of an idea, but it was more so because of the students who in fact felt that the JNU admission policy has to be different because it's a university with a difference, and that is what is perhaps stated in the foundational principles of the university. So in order to augment access, given the fact that you could rather select people on the basis of merit being integrated in various ways, the socio, cultural and economic dimensions which were being talked about, but there was hardly any statistics or hardly any kind of methodology which could be objectively introduced and implemented, and that was a major task before the JNU community. I think the students' union, which in fact had formed by then, there is hardly any record to in fact verify, but from whatever that I could really gather from people who were students here, they informed me that in 1974 there was some kind of a debate which was introduced. In 1974, there was some kind of a discussion both among the teachers and the students for some kind of admission policy which could be based on the required sensitivity to in fact expand the base of recruitment. So in 1974, as we know that we developed some kind of a framework which was implemented for the first time in 1975. It was a 20-point scale of deprivation. So out of 100 marks, say for example, you had 50 marks for the written examination and 30 for the interviews. Mind you, then the interviews used to take place for every level of admissions. That means for the undergraduate, for the postgraduate, and also for the research programs. It was compulsory that everybody appeared for the examination, and also based on that, they would also be interviewed. But alongside, and this constituted about 80 marks. 20 marks were given for various kinds of deprivations. At that time, we felt that some kind of index of deprivation has to be created, and so there were three different kinds of deprivations which we talked about. One was the economic deprivations, where in fact income and ownership of land, that means land holding and so on and so forth. These were taken into consideration. Social deprivation, depending upon which state the person came from, whether because by then several states had introduced some kind of OBC reservations, particularly in the south, not so much in the north, but also that was happening. There were different kinds of annexures, Annexure 1, Annexure 2 of the OBCs, which were incorporated. So, all those considerations were made. Besides, we already had to implement the ST/SC reservation, which was mandatory for the university to do that. So this was in addition to the ST/SC reservation. So the first important principle, which was in fact referred to, was that besides these deprivations, where SCs and STs were based on, of course, the SC deprivation was largely an outcome of the practice of unteachability, and the second, and that is ST reservation, was largely based on the criteria of access. That means if you are living in a remote area and so on and so forth, and it had nothing to do with poverty, or it had nothing to do with any other criteria. Just these two constitutionally determined criteria of deprivations were incorporated, and that these were the important principles on which the SC/ST reservations had to be implemented, of whatever 7.5% for the STs and 14.5%, 15% for the STs. But in order to expand the base, particularly when we realized, and it was very much visible, that the deprivations were not just restricted to these two different kinds of vulnerabilities or deprivations. One had to really expand these. And in order to do that, precisely because largely India was an agrarian economy, an agrarian country, large number of people lived in rural areas, structural problems were there both at the level of infrastructure and also at the level of society and economy. So one needed to really consider all these parameters and therefore incorporate some kind of a methodology. And at that particular point of time in 1975, the methodology was incorporated into a kind of a 20-point scale, which was the basis for the recruitment right until early 1980s, when it had to be revised in order to incorporate regional deprivations existed then, but then it was modified in order to expand the nature of regional or spatial deprivations, which in fact continues in some ways even today, but certainly not for the admission to the research program. I'm told that it continues for the programs such as the master's and the undergraduate programs. So what was the index like? The index, in fact, took into consideration, as I said, economic deprivation, so income and land ownership were important, social deprivations, on the lines that Kakasa Palelkar had talked about. Mandal Commission was still not there, so so whatever that existed in terms of OBC reservation that was incorporated, although Kakasa Palelkar's commission report was not accepted by the government, but in a certain way, because we were in a university where social scientists and other teachers and students were fully informed about the nature of deprivation. So OBC reservation, even before one could really have it implemented or see that being implemented at the all India level in higher education, JNU had taken the initiative of, in fact, incorporating some kind of OBC reservation, which in fact was based on the statistics or the information in respective states. So if the students were applying from a particular state, if they were listed there in some way or the other among the list of the OBCs, they would be given some kind of point. So this was a 20-point scale. And this 20-point scale also had this major component of the regional deprivation. Now what this regional deprivation really looks at? Regional deprivation looks at looks at various dimensions of how an area or a region or a place which in fact is provided or endowed with various kinds of facilities, and the areas which are deprived in terms of these infrastructural facilities, say schooling or various other kinds of economic investments and so on and so forth. It was understood that there are deprived people even in rich areas, in relatively better off areas, and that there were people even in worst off areas who are not so deprived. So in order to in fact bring about some kind of inclusivity where one could reach out to people in rural areas and far off areas, create a kind of an condition so that they could compete with people who are perhaps the students who have come from metropolitan background, who have come from better educational backgrounds and so on and so forth. So first of all, it was suggested that that candidates who have had any kind of an exposure until about matriculation, if they have obtained their matric degree or secondary degree from a private school, they would be given other kinds of deprivation points, but certainly they would not be entitled to deprivation points on the basis of the lack of access to public education or so on and so forth. So that was one criteria. So at that particular point of time, the regional deprivation was based on 2 or 3 important parameters. One was certainly literacy, and the other was, state per capita income, which had to be broken down into some kind of which had to be divided at the district level. So, so it was not an index which was only confined to the state. It was an index which was bottom up. That means, one was really trying to reach at the bottom level of the administrative structure. One would have been happier if one could perhaps, construct the index at the level of the development blocks But because the lack of statistics, it was thought that we should perhaps construct these indices for the at the level of the district. So, and so the regional deprivation based on literacy and per capita income and so on and so forth, was taken into consideration and in the first stage. And but then it was also not found to be very, very useful in the sense that, particularly with income, because income certificates were not very reliable. The land statistics that were obtained from Tehsildar were not found to be correct. So, the administration did try to, in fact, inquire about some of these, and they found that the information that was provided were not correct, or one could perhaps see that there was a lot of anomalies there. So this system was abandoned, and regional deprivation points were introduced for all time. So for the next 3 decades, 91 onwards, I think it was mid-80s onwards. 91 was the first index, which was comprehensive. Then, after, we have, and all these indices, regional deprivation indices, were created on the basis of the census data and the data obtained from the Ministry of Agriculture and so on and so forth. So it was a difficult task. And the most sensitive indices, which in fact, to begin with, it was literacy level, which was later on was further revised into literacy among illiteracy among women. The second index was participation of workers in non-agricultural activities, which was seen to be a kind of positive indicator. And there was one more indicator, yes, the per capita, it was the land productivity per hectare. And earlier it was based on limited aggregation of the crops, because it was a rural-based economy, and that perhaps was the most sensitive indicator. Earlier we started with nearly about 20-25 crops. Later on, based on the studies which were conducted in CSRD by Professor Bhalla, which is the agricultural growth work, which started from looking at the premium in the 60s and 70s, and there have been 5 different editions on that. So we expanded the number of crops to about 36, and by the time the last exercise was done, that was in 2011, we were in a position to incorporate more than about 40 crops. And the productivity levels were worked out on this basis. Now one could perhaps raise this question that initially there were fewer crops, and therefore whether it was representative of the all India situation, because there could be certain crops which were not being grown elsewhere. Crop diversity and cropping pattern being such. But and of course, the agricultural data was also very limited for some of these crops. But as the data was expanded and it was made available, we were in a position to incorporate that. And we were continuously evaluating the impact of the regional deprivations, which were based on these 3 indices. Of course, they were changed, there were modifications in between. So the index which was there in 91 was reformed in 2000. In 2001 was again reworked on in 2011. The major problem, another problem that we were facing during that particular point of time, that you work it out for a number of districts which are reported in the census, because the censuses are conducted only after 10 years. You don't have elaborate information for newly created districts. So that used to be always a problem, because by the time you started with 300 some districts, and you were admitting students late in 80s or 90s, you found that the number of districts have gone up. So how do you really make adjustments? So this was a real problem, and therefore some of us who were involved in this kind of an exercise were continuously being asked by the admissions branch as to what do we do now. There's a new district which has been carved out, so how do we really work out its score on the deprivation points? We resorted to, in fact, assigning the same value from where a new district was created from the older one, and that was the only way out, because one couldn't really estimate any other way. So with all these limitations, I think the intake or the nature of intake and the diversity of the students, which in fact came in the 80s, 70s, 80s, it really showed that this index is working. And if one were to perhaps take a look at the annual reports of JNU and look at the statistics on admissions, we'll find that in several centers and in schools, the proportion of those who came just by the virtue of regional deprivation points became very significant, and that was visible in our hostels, in our classrooms. The kind of diversity in the classrooms that perhaps we saw in JNU, both as a student. I was a student here from 1977 to 84, and later in 88 when I joined as faculty, I really saw the kind of diversity in hostels, in the classrooms, that brought in the kind of richness both in the academic content and the social life. One could perhaps imagine about, or maybe look at the map of India in one way or the other. But what India really comprised of was a kind of an experience, precisely because we had students not only from northern parts or from particular states, but we had students from almost all parts of India. And it was an experience living with them, interacting with them, and so on and so forth, both in the classroom and outside. So the objective, or maybe one of the principles of inclusivity, was implemented through the deprivation points, which I think is one of the most unique features that continues to define the JNU admission policy even today. Although I believe, in terms of its impact, it has come down. Nobody has studied it, but it is my feeling, precisely because in just about 7-8 years ago, I really started looking at some of the statistics as to what is the impact of the regional deprivation in terms of the JNU admission policy. And we found out that, and again, let me also tell you, and with a certain amount of pride, that JNU was again not only was responding to regional deprivation as an important indication which perhaps impacts everybody, not only people from the deprived communities, but also people from not so deprived communities, and therefore the structural problems which in fact obtain in certain areas, would impact everybody equitably. So therefore, that was the principle on which, this whole idea was implemented upon. Of course, we also had, say, a couple of reports at the All India level of the backward areas and so on and so forth. That was a time when also there were special attempts being made by Planning Commission in order to promote hill area development, desert area development, and so on and so forth. So the degree or the hierarchy of deprivations, which in fact existed at the regional level, at the spatial level, were addressed in some way or the other through this mechanism. But at the same time, we felt that there was a need to, in fact, do something about the gender deprivations. And Again, I must say, and I must congratulate the JNU community for having taken the initiative of introducing gender deprivations also. So across the board, if there is a woman candidate who is perhaps entitled to something like 5 marks, which really enhanced the composition, the gender composition of the students on the campus, especially in the last 2 decades or more. But at the same time, while one was moving in this direction, I felt, and at that particular point of time, I was assisting both the dean of the students' office as well as the admissions, and I realized that somewhere the gender deprivation marks, which comprised of 5 full marks being assigned to the candidate, was in a way diminishing the impact of regional deprivation. In a particular year, I remember I looked at the statistics and I found that the number of students who were admitted precisely or on account of regional deprivation had come down drastically. Why? Because the regional deprivation marks would go to the maximum of 4 marks, and the gender deprivation marks would go to 5 marks across the board. So one was really the metropolitan woman would cancel out the non-metropolitan woman and also the men. And that is where the impact was becoming somewhat limited. So there was a proposal which is there in the files of the university. Somehow it could not be implemented. We created some kind of a scale where it was suggested that the metropolitan woman, women coming from metropolitan areas, from public schooling background, may be given because of the fact that under all circumstances women are deprived in all classes, so they could perhaps be given lower marks as opposed to women who are coming from say rural background, from non-public school background, and so on and so forth. That, of course, was debated in a committee which was headed by Ajay Patnaik, and the committee submitted its report. That was in support 7-8 years ago, but perhaps it was never deliberated upon, or it was never translated into creating a kind of an index which could perhaps keep the regional deprivation marks intact and would not let it to be allow it to be overshadowed by gender deprivation. Not that there was any kind of a tug of war between the two, but structurally, because of the kind of an index that was introduced, one needed to really look at as to how one index was cancelling out the impact of the other index. So that is where we were until the time that the administration decided to in fact bring about a change in the regional deprivation statistics. And the latest that I'm told, and I'm not fully aware, I don't have a document to suggest as to whether these are the indices which have been introduced because of the pandemic and all that. So I think it was introduced just about 3 years or 4 years back. Now the index is based on women literacy, access to toilet at the household level, and then there are 2 more indicators. Perhaps one is a percentage of rural population, and 1 more. Now, if one were to perhaps take a look at some of these indicators, then one has to really first of all look at as to what is the degree of variability. If the variability is low, then the impact of these indicators in defining the level of deprivation or the sensitivity of this indicator will decline because everybody has the same level of deprivation. So that would be very difficult for you to, for us to in fact identify that. But I'm told that the regional deprivation is now working on these 4 criteria. The income or maybe plant productivity has been taken out. I think that remains still a very, very important attribute. I mean, those who work in the area of agriculture would perhaps understand the rural income is predominantly dependent on productivity levels, and therefore it is a very, very important indicator. The other indicator, which was workers in non-agricultural activities, or if you can reverse it, workers engaged in primary activities, that has also been taken off. I think there is a need for us to in fact bring these two back, in addition to in fact expanding it to incorporate several other parameters. Around 2011, we were also looking at, and we were positively looking at the fact that once this socio-economic caste census is completed and the statistics are made available, then perhaps it would be possible for us to expand the deprivation scores in JNU by incorporating several other factors. But then, as we all know, that the data of socio-economic caste census is not available. It's only available for some indicators at the state level. Therefore, in the absence of any reliable data to further expand the JNU admission policy in terms of the impact of deprivation marks has become a real problem. But where do we stand now in terms of policy? So, and that's where we have the new education policy, and where does the new education policy allow us to use these deprivation marks? As we all know, that in spite of the new education policy talking about the access and equity and excellence, we are just seeing the opposite that is happening. That's my understanding of the text as well as the developments which are taking place all around, both in the school sector and higher education sector. If there are, I think I'll stop here and talk about new education policy and its relationship with deprivation marks at a later stage. So this is what I thought I'll share with you insofar as the deprivation marks and the JNU's unique feature on expanding education, particularly higher education. And it has certainly had an impact, which we can see it around, we can see it in this particular hall also, and we have seen it in a much bigger way in the past. I believe we'll continue with the deprivation marks and rather expand it in order to in fact make it far more effective in terms of recruitment policy. Thank you very much.